Hi, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. This is Chris Petri. Welcome back. We are going to tackle the water to paint ratio concept in watercolor today. And this, if we can really understand this and get a real firm understanding of this, this is going to help our watercolor paintings tremendously. I know when I first started watercolor painting, this gave me a lot of trouble because sometimes I was adding too much water to my paintings. Sometimes I was going with I wasn't using enough water, and I was just really putting way too much paint on the paper, and it was kind of just unpleasant looking. So there is a nice kind of middle ground with watercolors that we need to achieve as a watercolor artist to make our paintings look pleasing. So if you're putting on way too much paint, watercolor paint that is, your painting is not going to look as pleasant as it can be. As well as if we're using too much water and in our paintings, in our watercolor paintings, that can look really unpleasant as well when there's too much water and too much bleeding and blossoming of colors and mixtures and so forth. So let's take a look at this, and after this video you will have a good understanding of keeping yourself organized with your watercolor paintings so that you can have a much more pleasant outcome. Okay, so let's look at, first of all, I do have a couple videos on my palette, my colors, and how I use my palette. You just type in Chris Petri, my palette, on YouTube, and you'll find the video, and I describe how I use my colors, my palette, and mixing paints and so forth. But I'll do a quick refresher here. Now here, when I say water to paint ratio, we are going to have a tremendously hard time trying to get a good, pleasing, positive painting if we're trying to use a palette where there's dry watercolors, dry paint, and then we're trying to dampen the brush and put the paint on the palette. This is going to cause a lot of problems with your paintings, and it caused me a lot of problems as well when I first started. So let's kind of see how this works. See how dull these colors look? There's like really no identifiable colors here because the paints aren't moist, so I can't even get a good water to paint ratio from this palette. So we can't work with a palette that has dry paints on it. We always have to remember that we must wet our palette before we work and start working when we paint, or squeeze fresh paint into the palette. So here is my palette, and as you can see, I have fresh, moist, goopy paint, which is what we have to have. In my technique, of course, if you've watched me paint for a time, or you've seen a number of videos, you'll see that I have moist, goopy paint at all times. And that's a great result right there. So if you keep your palette with fresh, moist paints, you're going to be able to get your proper consistencies, whether you go with a lot of water and you go with a light tonal value, or whether you go with a darker tonal value and almost straight paint. You're going to have control over your paints. So you can see how the lighter tonal value with lots of water is running, and this with less water is not running at all. So we want to keep that in mind when we're painting, that we want to control that water to paint ratio. So what I want to show here is how important this is, and if you can kind of maybe keep it if we can keep it to 3 at first, maybe 3 consistencies of water to paint ratio, then we can have an easier time. So we could say this is a lot of water to paint ratio, so way more water and way less paint. And you can see how that, so that would be nice for skies and maybe some water. Okay, and then let's go with a medium water to paint ratio, which is, an average amount of water and an average amount of paint. And then you can see how that does not run and drip all over the place on the palette. See how that's kind of staying put? So that's your medium amounts of water and paint together, the ratio. And that can be, maybe some sand or some earth colors in your painting. And then we have the third. Let's say the third is the least amount of water and mostly paint. And we just mix some blues and greens, and maybe we have some tree shapes here, and if we want to do some splattering, we just add a little more water to that. Maybe some bushes or trees. And you can see that's way less water, hardly any water at all, pretty much straight paint. Straight paint with very little water. And that can be our darkest tonal values in our painting. So if we have a good feel for, let's say, the 3 water to paint ratio amounts, this being a lot of water, not so much paint, and then an average amount of water and an average amount of paint, kind of like a, see how that, again, that doesn't, I'm tipping my palette here and you can see that's not running or anything, so that's a medium amount of water and paint, almost equal parts of water and paint. And then here, pretty much just straight out of the tube color, and that's your darkest tonal values, and your least amount of, it's just straight paint right out of the tube with hardly any water at all. And to achieve that, you probably want to have a tissue on hand close to your palette or your water bucket, and then when you rinse your brush off, you just tap off all the water, pretty much most of the water. Then you go into your paint, straight into the paint, the wet moist paint, and that's your pretty much straight paint, and that will give you your darkest tonal values. So then in your paintings you can achieve a whole range of tonal values by understanding that you can use your water to paint ratio to achieve your tonal values in your painting. And not to get much more complicated, but colors also inherently have tonal values to them. Obviously a dark blue like this, French ultramarine blue, is going to be very dark when you put it out onto the palette. But if you took a yellow ochre or raw sienna and put it out on the palette, it's whether it's got a moderate amount of water or just an average amount of water or hardly any water whatsoever, just straight paint, it's never going to be as dark as the French ultramarine blue or the burnt umber, as you can see. So your palette inherently has a wide range of tonal values, and you can use that as well when you're thinking about your tonal values in your painting. But a really critical part of this is knowing the amount of water. So if you can think about it as, a lot of water, an average amount of water, and hardly any water at all. And when you're thinking of that, you're thinking if you have a lot of water in your water to paint ratio, that's going to be where it runs a lot. It definitely moves around on your palette. It drips. So that's when you're adding a lot of water. That's fine when you're using maybe a sky or a watercolor. Your medium, your moderate amount of water and moderate amount of paint is not going to run. It's going to pretty much stay in place. It's not going to run everywhere, as you can see. It's not dripping. And then your straight out of the tube color is going to just be, it's going to be solid without any running or dilution. It's going to be pretty much just solid the way it comes right out of the tube. And then you can get a desired result like this, where you're kind of trying to break your painting down and saying, well, I want a light sky, a light blue sky in this painting because I have a photograph, or I'm out here I'm out here I'm on a farm and I'm looking out at the field and the trees and the ground, and I'm saying, wow, that sky's really light. Well, that's great. Then you're using lots of water, some blue and lots of water, and it's going to be dripping and running on your palette because you're using a lot of water. So that's a lot of water in your paint to water to paint ratio mix. Then when you get into maybe the grass areas and the ground areas, then you're saying, all right, my palette, the paint shouldn't be running all over like this blue is over here. It should be less water. So, an average amount of water. And then we can go in and do our ground areas. Let's say if we're just doing a farm scene or something, or a landscape painting. And then if we wanted to say we're going to do our trees and bushes in this scene, and they're looking very dark in tonal value, they're looking very dark as we look out into either in a photograph, or if we're out, let's say on a farm, and we're looking around and we're looking at the trees and we're saying, wow, those trees are dark and compared to the rest of the scene. Well, then we know we're going to use probably no water. We're just going to go straight into the paint and just use our nice moist wet goopy paint and get that nice consistency, and then we can go in and do our darks just like that. Okay, I hope this helps. I say if you can really get this down and really play with it, doing some small compositions, think about it, write down the definition or the idea of water to paint ratio. Think about it, and I guarantee your paintings are going to look better, you're going to have more fun, and you're going to enjoy your watercolors much more. Okay, everyone, we'll see you on the next video. Happy painting.